let's preview the Brooklyn Nets. They might be the NBA's worst team, but as we know, there's always something to pay attention to on every team in the NBA. Michael Bolton.
Thanks, Josh. It's Michael Bolton here, and it's time for another episode of the Locked On Fantasy Basketball Podcast. Let's get to it.
Let's get to it, indeed.
You are Locked On Fantasy, your daily NBA fantasy podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Fantasy Basketball Podcast, brought to you by Basketball Monster. My name is Josh Lloyd, and did you know that Randy is short for Randrew? I'm also the lead fantasy analyst at basketballmonster.com, and you can find me on Twitter, as always, at redrock_bball, on TikTok at redrock_bball, and on Instagram at Locked On Fantasy Basketball. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Thank you also for making Locked On Fantasy Basketball your first listen every day. We are free. We're available on all platforms, so give us a thumb, give us a double bang, single bang if you want, but then double it up later on, of course. Audio, video, comments, all that stuff. Like I said, we're talking Brooklyn Nets, a team who is terrible. They could make a move tomorrow, in a week, in 2 months, that changes everything about the squad. We'll see what we can get out of this. There is information, obviously, but this is going to be a team that you have to be on your toes, and there's going to be a lot of weird stuff going on throughout the year. So let's talk Nets. So joining me to talk about the Brooklyn Nets here from Locked On Nets, it is Doug Norrie. Doug, welcome back to the show. And this is a different position for this Nets squad, who they could easily be the worst team in the NBA. And I said this just before I brought you on, that this team could be changing multiple times during this season. First of all, is there any sort of word on anything bubbling at the moment?
No, it's been pretty quiet. I mean, we expected some of these guys to get dealt before the season started, but Sean Marks might be trying to drive too hard of a bargain where guys like Cam Johnson and Dorian Finney-Smith are concerned. So it seems like they're going to go into the season with some of these veterans still on a roster that, you said maybe the worst record in the basketball. All Nets fans are hoping with a wild exuberation that it is the worst record in basketball, because otherwise it would have all felt for naught. But it's weird, wild times for Brooklyn.
Yeah, it's a different position they've been in for many years here, that they are in a spot to be the worst, and they also have their draft pick back, so they can be bad. And that's, again, they're in a situation where we look at the roster and there's so many guys, you can go, well, he can be traded, he can be traded, he can be traded, he can be traded. Like, really, really clear where the guys are that they can move on from, which again is going to just change so much about the structure, dynamics, all that around this team. I want to start just by looking at the guys that they have acquired in this offseason. So it's Bojan Bogdanovic. They bring in Zaire Williams in a salary dump from Memphis. Shake Milton came across in the Mikal Bridges trade. They have Jalen Martin on a two-way who played in their G League team last season, and then they have also signed Killian Hayes. But just quickly on Killian, people immediately when that happened will go, man, well, do you think that Killian can do something? Is he even going to make the roster?
It's not guaranteed. I wouldn't be shocked if he didn't make it. I mean, the one piece of upside for him is that the team, even in this desperate state, is still desperately short on guards, especially just like lead handlers. And so he might fit a need there. Like, if he was going to break camp over some of these other guys that are maybe not guaranteed, I would say that, like, his ability to at least dribble is, I mean, he's got a ton of other flaws, obviously, but his ability to actually dribble is something a lot of the guys on this roster just can't even do outside of Dennis Schroeder. I mean, you mentioned Shake Milton. He's got some point guard chops, obviously, also, but like, they just don't really have much in the way of guards. So that's why I thought that signing in particular was interesting, because I actually do think there's a chance for him, mostly just based on roster makeup, which is, it's so light on any guards that almost anybody would be interesting to just kind of run out there when they roll the balls out. But I still don't think I think it's far from guaranteed, because he's got his own flaws that we are pretty well aware of at this point.
To me, that the signing there is interesting, that it maybe means that they are like actively trying to move off of Dennis Schroeder, because if Schroeder is there's Ben Simmons who handles the ball. We saw some interesting things from Keon Johnson. That's probably the last time I talk about Keon Johnson in this show, but in Summer League, there's some development stuff there from him. So like there are and Shake Milton. So like you could easily say like, well, what's the point of trying to see what Killian does if maybe we can see what Keon does? But if Schroeder moves on, then there is a huge need for that sort of a player. So that's, I think, where we get interested. But when I send all this stuff out to all of the hosts, Doug, I ask these questions, biggest addition, biggest loss. And with the Nets, I appreciate the direction you want, because we're going to talk about this guy anyway. I think he's one of the more interesting players in this team. And you did say, you told me, hey, I've screwed the rules here. Like, don't worry about it. I just want to do this. And you wanted to say that the biggest addition is going to be a full season of Noah Clowney, because we did not see much of Noah Clowney last season at all until the end of the season. And I remember vividly having a discussion with you about Noah Clowney at the start of the season. It's like, don't worry, I think you got a good player here. I'm assuming you've turned around on that, on the opinion about where Clowney is. So let's use this just to talk about Noah Clowney, who played some power forward and played some center. I was, from a fantasy perspective, hoping they let Nick Claxton go somewhere else so we could just get unfettered Noah Clowney. What's his best position? Is it next to Claxton? Is it as a center? Like, will they have any inclination to have him opening night starter? You're our player to build around, as our young prospect to build around, I guess.
Yeah, there's a lot to dive into him. So first of all, a huge L by me, because we did this around draft time last year where I was like, I wanted them to take Max Prosper, and you were like, no, Noah Clowney's the guy. And that stuck with me all season because you were pretty definitive about it. And we never saw him. And then he came up. He was doing well in the G League, but then he came up and really had a pretty underrated run for a guy as young as he is. But it was in the dregs of the season where if you're not really paying attention for the rest of the NBA, you'd easily miss it, right? Like, you would blink and miss it if you weren't really following the Nets pretty hardcore, or just maybe doing some like DFS, like fantasy stuff late, right? Like, everyone else is going to not have paid any attention to Noah Clowney at all. But what we saw from him was a couple of things. One, of all the guys that got dealt a pretty good hand with how things turned out, Noah Clowney was one of them. Because one, they waited all the way till the season was over to bring him up, so there was actually no pressure on him at all, right? He could come up, he kind of just play with, I think, some looseness. There wasn't going to be worry about whether he was going to retain a job or not. The season was over. They brought him up, and they just said, hey, let's see what happens. And what he showed was, he showed considerable growth, because if you had watched him at Summer League even early G League, he looked lost. Like he had no idea what was going on. He didn't really, defensive rotations were a mess. When he got the ball, he just didn't know what to happen. And it was really kind of like totally night and day when he came up and actually played real games in the NBA. One, he showed that physically and defensive ability wise, he was going to be able to really hang with pretty much anybody probably going forward. Really, when he starts to really develop and like really fills out the rest of the body, the athleticism is definitely there. His overall just basketball IQ, especially on the defensive end, was already really high, and he's so young. So when you look at it from just sort of just I would say borderline intangibles, they're there, and then you look at the raw physicality and just sort of know-how, that was there also. And then when you think about where he can play, I actually kind of think I was with you on the Claxton thing, although once they just had to spend the money, whatever, just spend the money and just kind of be done with it. But the thing is with Clowney, I think he showed that he could probably start at center, although he's a little undersized. Yeah. But I think there's a chance where you could probably play him as a stretch four, because the 3-point shooting is definitely going to play, it looks like. You could play him at a stretch four and play him alongside Claxton and have a really pretty dynamic defensive duo that can switch basically everything 1 through 5, that can weak side protect the rim, that can rebound, that are just really athletic. And I think that's really interesting. I do not think he starts day one, because they have probably some other veterans that they're just going to need to pay homage to. But going forward, he can be a 5, but I think the more interesting sort of thought experiment with him is that what happens if you play him at the 4 as almost like a rim running stretch 4 with Claxton, and just see what the possible defensive upside on that is. And that's like not an archetype of guy that the Nets have had really since I've been podcasting about the Nets. So I think and the Nets fans are pretty excited about it too. And I think there's a really good reason for it.
Yeah, they should be excited. He can block shots. He can shoot. I think he could do a bit with the ball in his hands. He could defend on the perimeter. There's a lot to like here. I think he'll be starting at some point during the season. We just got to wait to see when that happens. I'd love it to be opening night, but I think I wouldn't be shocked if, maybe not to the level that we saw it with Jalen Johnson in Atlanta last season, but if you saw him for a 3-month period put up 75% Jalen Johnson, maybe. I'm hopeful. I'm really excited to see where Clowney goes as we head through this season. We're going to talk about the guys they lost in just a sec, Doug, but today's episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. What are your self-care non-negotiables? We all know there's a lot of busy things, whether you've got a family, you've got kids, or you've got your own school life, and you've got your friends and social stuff. There are things that you just need to do to take care of yourself, because if you're not at your own best, well, you can't actually be there for others in the capacity that you need to be. And one of those things that you should consider as self-care is therapy. So if you've been thinking of starting therapy, you can give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's suited to your schedule. You just go in there, you fill out a questionnaire, and they match you up with a therapist who fits what you need. And if that doesn't work out and you meet the therapist, you go, absolutely not for me, bro. And they will switch you to a new one free of charge, because getting that connection is really important to be able to build up that rapport, talk through things, and get that self-care happening. So whether it is going to the gym or it's going to therapy, get your self-care sorted. Go and visit betterhelp.com/lockedonnba today to get 10% off your first month. That is BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedonnba. All right, we are talking about we're going to talk about the guys who left this squad over the offseason. Of course, the number one name there is Mikal Bridges. At the moment, Dennis Smith Jr. and Lonnie Walker played pretty key roles on this team, and they don't play anywhere at this point, so I don't really know what's going on with those guys, but they're not on the Nets team, and the Nets have got a full roster, so I guess they're a loss. Jacob Gilead and Keita Bates-Diop came across at towards the end of last season. Gilead unsigned, Bates-Diop in New York as part of the Bridges trade as well, but of course the number one or the biggest name to move on there is very obviously Mikal Bridges, who is the first trade between these two New York teams in like 40 years. The big haul of picks coming back, the Associated Rockets trade, we don't have to rehash any of that stuff. What I mainly want to talk about here with Bridges moving on, Doug, is not that they necessarily fill that space, but he had a 24% usage. So, like, what do they do? Obviously, they're going to be worse, and they want to be worse. They don't need to be, man, what are we going to do without Mikal? Because they're trying to be worse. But someone's going to take the shots. And we can make all the jokes, and we're going to talk about Cam Thomas later. He's not taking 50 shots a game. He'd love to, but he's not. Right? So, where are they going to go? Like, who's going to be able to sort of step up and at least take on an extra level of that self-creation that Mikal tried to do in his Brooklyn tenure?
Well, this is the other one that's hard. So, like, you know, there's been people in the Nets world or Nets fandom that, you know, are quote unquote concerned that the Nets are going to be, you know, they're going to win more games than we want them to and they're going to kind of, you know, bust out in this draft pick. And I keep trying to tell them, I'm like, they have no offense.
Oh, yeah,
right? Like, if you look at this team, I was like, no worries here. They have no one who can score. I mean, I'm sort of tongue in cheek mentioned before about how they don't have very few guys who can dribble. I mean, this is part of the problem. Is that it's a good problem. The Nets want to have this problem, but if you look at who's going to take the shots, it's really hard to figure out. I think they'll probably, let's say Schroeder ends up staying with the team, I think you'll see him actually he'll bump up in usage here. They'll run a lot of pick and roll with him. Just because like that's going to be one of the few things they can do. You mentioned Cam Thomas. There's probably only so many more shots in his shot diet that can get there at this point, right? Like more than he already takes. Yeah. So it's unrealistic to think, like you said, that's going to see a massive bump. It's actually very difficult to figure out where this comes from. Like Cam Johnson stays on the roster a little bit. Maybe there's a few shots there. These guys that we mentioned in terms of like guys who could step up and play a little bit of guard. Maybe you see some there. With Bogey, I'm not really sure. Bojan Bogdanovic, it's actually unclear about where he even is like in sort of rehab process because he was hurt at the end of the year. We've heard almost nothing about him at all. I actually hate to say, like, I don't know, but this is one of the reasons I'm not concerned with them winning really any games is they are not going to be able to score. I mean, this offense is going to be awful. Like they just don't have anything in on-ball creation. They have almost nothing like in terms of like dynamic ball handlers. They have no wings that can really attack you at all outside of just stretching the floor and hoping that's, you know, they catch a ball wide open. But, you know, you're not going to need a double team really any guys in this team except for maybe Cam Thomas, and like why even bother at this point? So I just don't actually totally know. I think you're going to see almost probably definitely the worst offense in the league. It might not be close. And most of it boils down to like what you said. when you start looking at the roster, like who can even get shots up on their own? Mikal struggled with this by one of the reasons Mikal got a kind of a bum rap near the end, sort of, and why in Nets fans' eyes his stock dropped significantly, which by the way, in the Knicks, thank God in the Knicks' eyes it didn't at all, but was because he couldn't beat guys one-on-one off the dribble. Like if you put a big wing on him, it was over. Like the game was over before it even started. He couldn't beat anyone off the dribble because he was like miscast, and he still would have been the Nets' best player if he was on the team. So it's just going to be such a brutal offense because you can't even squint and see it around who's going to be able to attack any of these defenses because they just really don't have the guy. So that's a lot of that's a non-answer, but it's mostly just highlighting what I hope people are realizing here is that this roster is dreadful, and especially when you get to the guards.
Let's talk about their projected starters because it's a weird one where you look at this and I could give you even 3 other names that could potentially start. So you've gone with Dennis Schroeder, Cam Thomas, Cam Johnson, Ben Simmons, and Nick Claxton. I could argue that maybe Simmons starts and Schroeder doesn't, but I don't know. Simmons could also play 5 games. I've got no idea. Like Bojan Bogdanovic could start, Dorian Finney-Smith could start, Noah Clowney could start. Summer League MVP Jalen Wilson, well, he couldn't start, but there's just a bunch of different guys here who could step. Honestly, if Killian Hayes made the roster, would they start him? Who knows? And it could change 4 times during the season with a trade that happens in training camp or one that happens in December, then 2 that happen in February or whatever. There's so many guys that can move on here. So I don't know. We've seen struggles at times with the Simmons and Claxton pairing. So we don't know how that's going to work. It's just a very weird situation. There are guys that just don't belong on this team, like Dennis Schroeder, who started out really hot last season in Toronto and then fell back to being Dennis Schroeder, and he was very much Dennis Schroeder in Brooklyn. But like you said earlier, Doug, somebody is going to need the ball in their hands. Somebody is going to need to take some shots, and he's probably the only guy here I'd say that's got any level of self-creation upside. It's probably him.
Look, when you asked for the starting lineup, I really didn't give that starting lineup with any kind of real conviction. Adam and I did. We can't. And we did a podcast recently where we just basically the whole podcast was us trying to guess what the opening night minutes rotations would be with this team. And we purposely didn't talk about it ahead of time and just went into the podcast because we knew that we were going to be really different from each other, and we just knew it was going to be interesting to try to break down the differences. And that's really the case with this team, is that trying to make any real guesses around the minutes, getting to 240 minutes on this team, it's not hard to get to the 240, but figuring out where the 240 goes is a real challenge because it requires a couple different narratives that you really have to sort of weave together. I put Ben Simmons in the starting lineup based on really salary alone. That was honestly the reason I did it. I was like, he makes $40 million. He's been there a while. They're probably hoping that they get some kind of rehabilitation on him, and let's see where it goes. They could easily not. I actually wouldn't suggest doing it because I think that there's better versions of the team without him in it. Like pairing with Claxton's been a known disaster. So I wouldn't do it, but it was mostly just, I kind of was defaulting to salary at the beginning of the year, right? If you're running a locker room, you have salary guys, they're veterans. DFS, Dorian Finney-Smith falls into this category too. It's like, hey, these guys are veterans. They're not going to be on the team forever. Let's treat them right. Give them the minutes. Try to get the trade value there. And then we'll do business with what's left after the trade deadline. That was kind of my thinking. Adam saw it a different way where he saw more of the young guys getting played, but I just was hard for me to kind of see that in terms of from a front office perspective, when you knew the games didn't matter anyway. It's like, hey, let's be an organization that veterans still kind of respect. That's going to be important for us later. We're not going to start probably Noah Clowney over Dorian Finney-Smith and Ben Simmons and these other guys simply based on age. And by the way, that's okay. His time will come. That was kind of my thinking. It was really more of a PR optics thing than it was an actual basketball. What's our best 5? I mean, kind of who cares, right? With the Nets. But that was sort of how I approached it, thinking about more what the conversation would be like in the locker room and less about what actually was an optimal 5 on the court, which they'll end up having to get to later, if that makes sense. But these are what other ways can you think about this team? So when I put Ben Simmons in the starting lineup, that was kind of the idea, and my guess is that no one on that team thinks he's going to be healthy and for a whole season anyway. And if he is, great, maybe he got something. But like they just have these weird storylines, so that was kind of where I took the starting lineup.
I think it might be the same, but again, I don't feel any real level of confidence in that. Like I don't know where Bojan or Finney-Smith sits, and it's very easy to denigrate Ben Simmons and talk about injuries and all that sort of stuff. But look, if you're going to look at it right now, he is better than Dorian Finney-Smith as a player. If he's healthier there, he's a better player, and he's a better player currently than Noah Clowney. Is he more important for the Nets? Of course he isn't, but it doesn't, like, if you are, especially we'll get to this in a second, new coach, you got to sort of have like, this guy's better, so like, you can't be like, all right guys, we don't care about anything. Everyone just do whatever for the season. That doesn't work as a new head coach, because you'll be out of there like straight away. Like you can't sort of do that as a new head coach, even though if we all can see how important that is for the future of the team. And that's why they have to move off of some of these guys, because that gives you that opportunity to say, all right, now there's no one in the way who's definitely better. Let's go from there. And in terms of looking at the bench group, you got Shake Milton in this group. We've got Bojan Bogdanovic and Dorian Finney-Smith and Trendon Watford and Noah Clowney. There is a name here. Then it's going to be the last time we mention this name, I think, on this show. Or it's a name that's not there. It's Day'Ron Sharpe, who last season, Claxton got injured early in the season, and Jacques Vaughn played Sharpe 3 minutes. It made no sense to me. They were playing Dorian Finney-Smith at center. They reduced Sharpe's minutes, even though Claxton went down. Where are we at with him? I think he can be a solid enough player, but it is also very, very easy to see a scenario like this where it's Claxton, it's Clowney, and then Sharpe sits around and does nothing. I don't have a huge level of confidence in how the Nets view Day'Ron Sharpe.
We don't either. And one of the things that really throws you off around him is that at the end of the season last year, when I was mentioning when they kind of cried no hope, when at the end, when they were just kind of, they knew it was over, they brought Clowney up. That's actually where we thought we were going to see a lot of Sharpe minutes because, hey, like this is a chance to kind of see what we got here. We got to make a decision on an extension, maybe with him at some point. Like, let's see what we got. There's nothing to lose. And he just didn't play at all. Yeah. And so it's very hard to understand sort of how the organization views him. If you watch him on a tape level, he improved last year for sure, right? Like the decision making improved. He's one of the best per minute rebounders, especially offensive rebounders in all of basketball. And that can sometimes be a lumpy stat, and it also can sometimes benefit guys that maybe aren't the best, right? Like in terms of like 40 or 30 minute a game guys, but he can really rebound. Like it's a real NBA skill. Where the Nets view him, I would have had a very different opinion on this if those last like 7 or 8 games of the season just hadn't seen him get dustballed and he never came up. They really never played. There's some problematic pieces of his game that made it a little harder for them to play. They ran like a lot of a switch everything scheme, and he's kind of like the one guy that couldn't do that. He had to play drop defense. They didn't really have any on the ball defender, like point of attack defenders that could really help him, except for Dennis Smith Jr. When those two guys played together, it was actually pretty good, but DSJ was really the only guy that could really, really ball hawk around screens and allow him to play drop. No one else could. So when he came in there, drop kind of looked like a mess. Not really his fault. And then except for Dennis Schroeder, they don't really have anyone that can run like high pick and roll where he can be a rim runner and use his size. So they weren't able to utilize his skills there either. So he's a little bit of a victim of circumstance, I think, but also they could have just kept playing him at the end because who cares anyway, and they didn't. So he's another one. He's a real head scratcher to know how the organization views him around an organization that's been head scratching forever around some of these young guys. Like it took forever for Cam Thomas to start and actually play. And it's been very difficult to evaluate how this Nets team evaluates their young players up until now. Maybe that's going to change, but Day'Ron Sharpe fits right into that mold of sometimes we're, doing this podcast and covering this team for years now. This has been a leak, I think, for them. And Sharpe, to me, sort of exemplifies it also. It's like, how do they view him? We don't have any idea. Have they given him the best foot forward? I'm also not sure about that either.
We're going to talk about the impact of new coach Jordi Fernandez in a sec, but today's episode is brought to you by the Game Time app. Right now, Game Time, well, there's so many things that you can do on Game Time. We know this. We've got a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting the tickets for your favorite live events easier, hassle-free. Instead of having to sift through everything that's there, they go through and they find the best options and they highlight those for you. So you don't have to worry about going through the thousands of different options. They filter out the fluff and give you the incredible deals on the great seats, so you don't have to waste that time. There are so many great things about that, finding that super deal in terms of the list of all the tickets. Like, it's just way easier to do now on Game Time. Like, there's always going to be those great deals there, and we know that Game Time's famous for that, but now they're just filtering out, they're just putting it right in front of your face. They've also got the flash deals, so something that happens like this moment. Game coming up tonight, they'll chuck the tickets out there. They'll tell you about it on your phone. Get there. The closer it gets to game time, the tickets actually go down in price as well. The way that Game Time picks, again, this is a revolutionary thing, curating the best value tickets for the event that you're looking for. So take the guesswork out of buying concert tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, use the code or create an account and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. I just mentioned it, Doug, we do have a new coach on this team. Jordi Fernandez comes in. He's fresh off coaching in the Olympics. It's always hard with these first-time coaches who have been assistant coaches. At least we've got some head coaching experience for him in Canada. What's the difference that Jordi brings to this squad versus the coaching scenario that we had running through all of last season?
So I think they really kind of lucked out here in terms of Jordi Fernandez, because I agree with you that it's often very difficult to evaluate what assistant coaches are going to bring to the table, mostly because it's probably almost impossible for anyone to evaluate this, right? Until you sit at the last chair on the bench as a coach, it's all basically interviews and kind of crossing your fingers, right? With him, even though he hasn't been there in the NBA, having that Team Canada position, I actually think is really, really important. This is why I think why you see some of these success from some of these guys that come over from the G League is because just being able to make those in-game decisions and just having confidence with sort of the flow there actually really matters in a way that's very difficult to recreate if you are just even a lead assistant on an NBA team, right? And so, or like a guy like JJ Redick, who just hasn't coached at all, or a guy like Steve Nash, who didn't coach at all, right? Like the Nets have a guy that in their own backyard that this happened with. So I think with Jordi Fernandez, the fact that he's A, really, really well respected in the game, B, that he had that Team Canada approach, which is even better in some ways than the G League thing, because there was actually real guys on that team, right? SGA, Jamal Murray, like that has real NBA sort of star level guys on there who were willing to listen to his coaching also, which is another thing that almost no assistant coach brings with them as part of the resume. So I think those two things are really, really important. I think it's been made pretty clear that he understood that there was a chance that the Bridges thing would happen when he was hired. It's probably the reason the guys like Budenholzer ended up not taking the job. Maybe even why Kevin Young didn't take the job was that like the uncertainty around whether they were going to move forward with Bridges or not. Maybe that was probably made clear to all these guys, and Jordi was just it seems like he was fine with the uncertainty. So to kind of know that was going to be the case going in, and this was going to be a developmental track rather than maybe, a playoff track, I think that helps soften the blow too. So for him, I think of everything to get excited about, he might be one of the top ones. I know that's a weird thing to say about a coach. I'm not sure I would have the same feeling if it was just a lead assistant coming from somewhere as their first gig. But for me, the Team Canada thing really, really matters. And if you just read at all about his career, right, coming from overseas and then coming to the Kings, and like how highly respected he is basically at every stop he's been at, I think they really have a guy that they can grow with here. So that is a thing to get excited about. I'm not sure you see tons of it in terms of like on the court stuff this year, but maybe outperforming. But I think just in terms of sort of like pedigree for a team in the Nets position, they have a good coach where you don't run the risk of, like we've seen with some of these other tanking teams like Houston a couple years ago, where it's literally like, hey, let's roll the balls out and see what happens. I don't think that's going to be the case with this team. And I think it's mostly because of like sort of the background that he's already bringing into the door with him.
Your answer to these next questions was interesting to me. It really doesn't matter how we position them necessarily, but I ask for who the player to watch for the season is, and your answer was Ben Simmons, because we really don't know, I guess, where Simmons is. probably smart of us to ignore all workout videos from Ben Simmons at any point. And like, I don't think there's no, that's not true. There is definitely people who are still like, nah, bro's not injured. He's nothing wrong with him. Like you don't get your back cut open if you're not injured. There is a obvious problem here of some description. But I don't know that we 100% know what the issue is. But again, if you're getting cut open in your spine, safe to say something's actually going on there, right? What is there any latest update here on Simmons? And let's just say that. Is there any update on him?
There's no update except for the aforementioned workout videos, which we get every year. So those are all, sort of laughable at this point, mostly like, tongue in cheek laughable. The reason so there's no real update on him at all. That actually is not too different than other seasons either, right? So this off season is not different than the other previous off seasons with him. Well, the reason I put him down is because I think he has the widest range of crazy outcomes this year of anybody on the team.
Yeah, it's true.
Because his outcomes go from fully healthy back to old Ben Simmons, right? Like just looks great, pushing the pace. He kind of looked like this a few moments last year when he played. And you could kind of see glimmers or glimpses of the old Ben Simmons. So I think he has like that in his range. And I think this is Ben Simmons' last NBA season in his range, right? Like I think the curve on his outcomes is so crazy long that it's sort of fascinating. And I actually think, unfortunately, with him, I think he's the most interesting. I actually think we'll know that the quickest with him too, right? Like I think that we might know within like 15 games which side we're much closer to. Probably erring on the side of caution with like the, all the way back to all NBA level, because I think that's just kind of a pipe dream at this point. But also, if he is looking good, we might be like, oh, okay, this is interesting. Like he's fully healthy again for, finally. Maybe the pressure's off in Brooklyn, right? Like maybe there's no pressure on this team. He feels the pressure's off and he just feels free to play because he knows the outcomes don't really matter. I think that's a real narrative with this guy. Where it's just like the wins and losses don't matter. I can just play and maybe rehabilitate some of my value. Or he gets hurt or it looks really bad. And we're asking ourselves, hey, is this like the end of his career? Right. Because he's not, is he a candidate to sign like a vet minimum next year? I don't see him really doing that. No. He doesn't strike me as the kind of guy that's going to want to go that direction. So I just think it's like, that's why it's most interesting, because I think that it's just such a fall from grace for him. And it's very rare we talk about a guy who was, all NBA defensive player of the year candidate 4 years ago, still technically age-wise around his peak or his prime.
26?
Yeah, right. So he's like right in those prime years. He's like, I think he's 28. Maybe I'm wrong. But regardless, it doesn't matter. Like he's in that range anyway. He's 28. So, and now we might be talking like, hey, it might be over for him. Yeah. And that's just fascinating. And it's sad and it's a bummer. Like no one roots for this stuff, but I think that you'd be crazy if you just didn't kind of tell it like it is. And that's really where it seems to be with him.
Yeah, look, there are plenty of people that hate him, and I get it. He rubs a lot of people the wrong way for many reasons, but there is a lot of stuff that's just complete bullshit that's chucked out about Simmons. Like I said, he's not faking a back injury because he just wants to get money and not play. Like, okay, you can say, well, maybe he doesn't love basketball as much as other people or whatever. You just don't get you don't get cut open for things that are fake. And imagine you are this guy who's considered by many to be the best defender in the entire NBA, a guy that's a future star and an all-NBA player, and then all of a sudden everything falls apart body-wise, mentally. Like, that's hard to recover from. And look, we can't put ourselves in that position. Some of us would get back and some of us wouldn't. Like, it is a sad situation. We talk about the lack of usage. Simmons had many seasons where he was like an 18, 19%, even 20% usage player. I think he actually went over 20% in Philadelphia a couple of times. He was sitting at 13 last season for Brooklyn. I'm not saying that he's going to get back to that level, but he's done it. So we'll see whether he's able to do anything that's different there. It is, again, it's probably one of the more interesting things in the entire league, honestly, to see what happens. But there are a lot of people who've just written off and said it's just never happening ever, and he's never going to do anything different. And maybe that's the case. But
if I were to put it I think the best way I think try to think about these things is just not whether be definitive about it, but just talk about it probabilistically, right? If I had to judge this on probabilities based on past evidence of what's happened, you would have to trend toward not going to play for two reasons, or like it's kind of over because I've always said this on the podcast. There's the injury part, which is important to factor in. To me, there's also the part where he just sat out of playing for non-injury reasons, which actually counts for even more for putting it on the probability curve that he wouldn't play anymore, right? It's one thing to get injured, but when you add in the part where you don't end up playing because your feelings were hurt, not saying he was even wrong, but he didn't play because he didn't like what Doc Rivers said. It was a stupid thing for Rivers to say, but when you choose to not play for non-injury reasons, it just it increases the probability that you will not play for other reasons. And that's why I say that. I agree with you. It's crazy to like just say he's faking. I think there's real criticism you can sort of levy at him.
Absolutely.
Faking it is definitely not one of them, but I always just look back to that season that he sat out with Philly. And I always use that as actually if you're using, Bayes' theorem where it's like, hey, examine your priors. Well, one of my priors tells me that he will sit out for reasons that are not injuries. So when that's the case, you just have to, there's other reasons you cannot be injured and not play. Right. Yeah. And that's kind of like where I kind of come down with him.
Yeah. Look, and that's totally reasonable. Like there are plenty of players in the past who had disagreements with their coach and playing time, but they don't usually sit out a season waiting for something to be resolved there. You can level all those sort of criticisms on him, and that's fair enough. It was a weird and wild situation, but then all these injuries and then crept up on this, and it's just gone completely like in a direction that I don't think anyone could have seen it go this direction. What this does bring us to, many people would say, hey, isn't Ben Simmons the make or break player? And yeah, he is. There's a lot of those guys on this team, but the player that you put as the make or break, I really want to hear what your thought process is on this. You put Cam Thomas here because we all know what's likely to happen here. We've talked about it already. Thomas, it's not like he wasn't taking shots. He had a 30+% usage last season. He will take a few more, but he doesn't have this scope to go and take gigantic amounts more of shots because it's just not a feasible thing that he takes like 80% of the shots when he's on the court. So what do we mean? What do you mean by make or break? Is it like the idea of Cam Thomas is our offensive hub that we can then build the next Nets team around, and then if it goes terribly, then they've got to scrap that plan? Is that sort of what you mean?
Yeah, so there's a couple things here. Make or break, right? It's make or break in terms of how the organization sees him, right? Mm-hmm. They have not extended him, so he's rookie extension eligible. They have not extended him yet, and this is basically the last year of the contract. So it's make or break in terms of like how the organization sees him as a viable piece going forward. I think they will sign him to a longer term deal just because, again, they're going to have the money, and he can do something that some things that the other guys can't on the team. So I don't think that that's off the table, but it's make or break from just like how the organization sees him. I think that's one part. The other part too is to see, this is going to be the year where you're going to see if there's more in his bag than just, a crazy shot diet. And that's kind of it, because for him to be anything more than just sort of like microwave scorer, possibly lots of shot, bad team guy, right? We're not totally sure. This is going to be the chance to see that. And the ways that I think we're going to be able to tell if that's happening or not, one, we need to see like the assist levels climb up here. They started to it in the second half of the season last year. Like the assist numbers were going up, which is a really good sign. If you were watching him every night, you just saw that he was making more reads that he hadn't made in the past. Like he was getting, quicker out of the trap, which they did start trapping him at times. Like sort of starting with the Atlanta game was the first time he saw it. And he was able to, get out of double teams a little quicker. Good sign. He was able to make more read and react stuff toward the rim. He was tried getting in on the lob game. Throwing lobs, right? In terms of guys running to the rim, another good sign. So if he's able to unlock pieces of his game there, then I think you can actually you can draw a better line about whether or not you call them an offensive like hub or maybe an offensive engine. I don't think he ever gets totally there, but if you want to start putting him in like I don't really mean this as a comp, but like these sort of like combo, not really point guards, but can kind of run it at times, but have crazy offensive bag like Booker or Mitchell. I don't think he gets to those levels, but these guys that like aren't straight ones, aren't straight twos, kind of in between. I think like he needs to show that he can get to that point with just like his sort of read and react on offense, and that he's going to care on defense. Like if he can do those things, and that's hard in a bad team, right? And so that's a little less interesting to me than just, do we see him? Can he make sort of like secondary reads outside of just getting his own shot, that will tell a big story for me about whether or not like he has real room to grow this season. And he's put on a team that should be able to try it out. I think he actually has it in him, but he's also just done so little of it that I think there's going to be growing pains along the way. So that's those are the two things I meant. Like, are the Nets going to be committed to him, and will he be able to expand his offensive game where you can really imagine that he can just be more than just a scorer? Is there something more that he can kind of tax defenses with? So that's what I want. That's the most thing I want to see. And they have the guys on the team that I think can help him. Like, there are some floor spacers. There are guys that can get to the rim, right? Like, he's actually Ben Simmons is the perfect running mate with a guy like Cam Thomas. Honestly, they're like built to play together, right? Yep. Ben Simmons can do all the things that Cam Thomas can't do.
It's way better to have Ben Simmons playing point with Cam Thomas than it is to have Dennis Schroeder. It is
totally agree.
That's what I want them to. It is 100 times better for the development of Cam Thomas and even just the on-court aesthetics of this team than to have Dennis Schroeder next to him. So, like, that's again.
If you you put a player in a lab that said who would be the perfect guy to play next to Cam Thomas, it would 100% be Ben Simmons, like without a doubt. I just don't know if we ever see it.
Yeah, well, that's the other part. Now, Thomas is an interesting guy because he gets a lot of criticism. I do a lot of that criticism, but again, a lot of the criticism I had of Cam Thomas was not as much from last season, but from the year before. Now, he still does way too much mid-range stuff. He does still too much of that. He still doesn't move the ball enough. He still doesn't care defensively. He is, shooting it from three is better. His passing did improve, but there's still it's still hard to and he's always had this reputation of a guy that just makes shots. That's what it was out of LSU, but what else is coming? And we still haven't fully seen that. Where do you reckon, in terms of mid-range shot attempts per game, Cam Thomas would have ranked in the entirety of the NBA last season?
Oh, you asking me off the top of my head? I mean, it was probably pretty high. He gets into that. Do you have the number in front of you?
I do have it here. Yeah.
My guess is it's high because I know that he gets into like this. He kind of worms his way into the middle and he hits these like crazy. If you watch him a lot, he hits these crazy, like sort of. I tried to nickname the owl, and I was hoping this would catch on because he's like got this crazy movement where, as long as his head is turned toward the basket, he can make shots, and like nothing else needs to be turned that way. So it's like he turns his head like an owl. But my guess is it's really probably in the top like 5%, right? Probably higher. I mean, top 10 overall, maybe. I don't know.
In the top 3% actually. So he's 13th overall in the NBA, and the names ahead of him, it's Embiid, Durant, Brunson, DeRozan, Shea, Booker, Ingram, which that needs to change. Doncic, Adebayo, interestingly enough, De'Aaron Fox, DeAndre Ayton, Kawhi Leonard, Cam Thomas. So there's a lot.
It's like an all NBA. It's like the all NBA team.
Yeah, except for Brandon Ingram and DeAndre Ayton. But yeah, it is. It's the best players in the NBA. Basically, they're doing a lot of other things as well. And we look at he's the player that played the fewest minutes out of that group as well. But they're all taking way more shots at the rim. They're all taking, majority of them are, especially the perimeter guys, are taking a lot more 3-pointers than he is. And that's what it's about. That just change in distribution. He can still be a good mid-range player. It's about getting the right balance there, because when there's not as many other threats on the team, maybe we see more of that focus taking that part away and seeing what else he can do. So look, he is going to have to do a lot. He's going to have to play a lot of minutes. He's going to take a lot of shots, but I guess at the part of it, and it's the make or break, is how much do they pay him? Where do they build around? Like where does it go from here as we move forward for this squad? Because it's probably, along with maybe the development of a Noah Clowney, one of the bigger things that they have to really sort of focus on for the season. If we, Doug, look at the major storyline upcoming for this season, I guess to me it's pretty obvious. It's just how bad can they be, and I think the answer is it's pretty bad. We're going to get into your team record prediction in a second, but I think this gets pretty ugly pretty fast on this squad. What I do want to now ask you this question here in terms of my burning question for the team. We've just come off talking about Cam Thomas. So my question is the focus of the squad, do you think, on player development, or is it Cam Thomas development? Like, we can talk about Thomas taking all these shots and he's got to do all these things, but will they prioritize that around him versus like some other guys who maybe it is a Noah Clowney, or see what Jalen Wilson does, or what does Keon Johnson do anything? Or is it all going to be like, hey, we just need to get Cam to do these things? And if he doesn't, we need to reassess what we're doing.
I think it will be about player development. I still think they're in this stage of their rebuild where they're not far enough along to have those top end lottery picks that you can kind of like really start dreaming on. So because they're a year away from that, they just haven't. They're in the full reset mode. This is where I think I don't think it's going to be like all about Cam Thomas necessarily. I think they're going to prioritize the sort of like seeing what they have with everyone, with the understanding that most guys won't be on the team. They're going to have so many draft picks in the next couple of years that like those are going to be the guys that are on the team, right? It's not really who's here. I think with Thomas, he gets lucky. It's like sort of what we talked about at the beginning. He gets lucky in terms of sort of circumstance in that they have too few other guys that can even score at all. Like sometimes when you would see, think back, I mentioned Houston before. It's like, think back when it was like Kevin Porter and Jalen Green, right? Yeah. Kevin Porter Jr. And it was like, okay, well, you have a couple guys who just want to score all the time and they can just like play their terrible, dueling banjos of shots. Like the Nets don't even have another guy like that can really do it. And so I think Thomas gets helped with that. It's actually what helps him a lot with those mid-range, like that mid-range percentage. And if you look at his points per minute, he's on that list for the best players in the league too. Is he as good as those guys? No, but he's in a situation where they just absolutely green lighted him for a whole season. And so there are probably some other guys that can live in that same world, but he's still a very, very good scorer. So I don't think it's going to be all about him, but like I said, circumstantially, there's just so few other guys that can do it that I think they're just going to end up just sort of defaulting to him getting a lot of shots anyway, because it's just going to make sense. He's the only one that can really get them. And I don't think you'll see crazy minutes. Like you're not going to see like, mid 30s minutes for him or anything. I think they'll limit it some there. And I think that they'll probably spend the rest of the time just saying, hey, when we're a season from now, who do we still like? Can we bring back a Keon Johnson? Can we bring back a Killian Hayes? That's sort of the evaluation that they're going to be doing is who can kind of stick for the long term or even like the next couple of years, Jalen Wilson, and who we're just going to jettison once all these draft picks come in because they just have so many over the next couple of years. And those are the guys, my guess is that next group is who's going to kind of take over. And this is just sort of like a way station year for the team.
Your bold prediction on this team or for this team, Doug, was something that we discussed earlier, and it was that Noah Clowney becomes a more popular or more well-known player league-wide after this season. Because like you said at the beginning of the show, like if you weren't paying attention to Nets basketball in April or March, and fair enough, you might not have seen him start to establish himself as a real NBA contributor. Now, playing in March and April, you're also playing against a bunch of other teams who are Nets adjacent in terms of their lack of focus or care in what they're doing. So we need to see it against real opponents. But he is someone that is really intriguing for us moving forward. Now, the big question, the big one we need to ask here, Doug, is the team record. We saw Detroit win, 14 games last season. You don't think the Nets are quite that bad, but you do have them going under 20. What is a worst case scenario outcome, do you think? Not in terms of, they want to lose, we know this, but like in terms of what the record is, like how actually bad could it get?
I mean, they could win like 10 games. I think they have it 19.5. I would easily take the under. Mm-hmm. As I've been team over with this team every year, and it's bit me every time. So now I'm going to go under. They're going to go over. This is kind of how the story usually plays out. But it's just so hard to look at this team and find the wins, and mostly because it's so hard to look at this team and find the scoring. And when you can't do that, even with teams like Detroit last year, where you have a Cade Cunningham, even like Jaden Ivey, right? Like guys that can at least get to the rim, right? You just have some other sort of like young and up and coming talent. The Nets just have really nothing. And I can't imagine a world where they get to like this 19.5 wins at all. And except unless like they just get crazy coached and they just go absolutely all out every single game with some of these young guys. And even then, I don't think they have enough scoring. So I can pretty confidently take the under. I think like that Pistons year is easily in range of this team, just because I just look at this roster and it's the least talented roster in basketball, and I just don't even think it's close.
Yeah, I put out a graphic today about the projected starting lineup and saying, yeah, this is the NBA's worst team. And then people go, nah, what about Portland or Washington? Bro, like, not
no way,
not close. Like,
no way.
It's not.
Kyle Kuzma, like, would be the best guy on the Nets easily, right?
Like,
and like
Anthony Simons,
like
DeAndre Ayton,
it would be the best guy on the team easily, right? Shaden Sharp, like
Yes.
even throw with Cam Thomas, or like we at least be having discussions. All these teams have guys.
Jordan Poole would be the best player on this team.
No, you're gonna get some Cam. There's a lot of Cam Thomas. There's a lot of Cam Thomas stands out there, man. I'm not gonna even go with you on that one because I know what happens if you say anything about this guy.
So do
He's
I.
got a lot of stands out there. So I'm gonna let you can.
That's why I lean into it, because I cop it all the time about it. But like, yeah. That's okay. I know that I'm going to take that, and you've got to deal with the fans all the time. But again, not all Cam Thomas stands are Nets fans, which is another weird thing as well. Last thing, Doug, I got a quiz question for you. It's not really a quiz; it's more just let's talk about players, because it's the 24-25 season. The Nets will probably not win 24 or 25 games this year. But what I want to know is the first person in your mind who has played for the Nets who wears number 24 or 25 on their jersey. What's the first name that comes to mind?
I gotta tell you something. I'm gonna sound so bad. You're never gonna believe this. I did a podcast the other day with this. Can I tell you something? I don't know anybody's jersey number. Is that bad?
No,
I don't even care about saying.
There's definitely two groups. There's everyone who knows the history of jersey numbers, or there's someone who goes, bro, I got no idea. I look at their faces.
I've watched. I guarantee that I've watched more Nets basketball than. I'm in the top 1% of Nets basketball over the last 3 years. I can say that unequivocally because like I watched every game and most games twice, right? So there's very few people in the world that have watched more Nets game than me. I don't know two things in this world. I don't know anyone's jersey number, and I don't know anyone's birthdays, and that includes my own family. For some reason, these things do not stick in my head at all. I couldn't tell you anybody. I don't know anyone's jersey numbers. And it's just something that goes right in and right out. I know there's going to be a level of fan that's going to say that, and I'm going to look like I've never watched any games in my life. I get it, but I just don't. I hate lying about this. I got trapped with this on another podcast, guesting on another podcast recently, and I think they cut it out of the podcast because they thought it made me look bad. I don't really care, but like that's just my brain doesn't work. So your guess is as good as mine. I have no idea.
Cam Thomas wore number 24, or currently wears number 24 for this team. But actually, number 24 has got a pretty interesting history on this team. Rondé Hollis-Jefferson, Richard Jefferson was number 24 on this team. Reggie Theus was number 24. But interesting, number 25 is a retired number for the Nets retired for a guy called Bill Malchione, who
Bill Malchione?
Sorry,
he might have been there.
Sorry for Bill. I don't really know much about him. He finished playing in 1976, but his number is retired, number 25. And only two people have ever worn that number, him and Tony Jackson. And again, apologies to these guys. I don't know who they are. And that is the end of that segment. Doug, what's going on over at Locked On Nets at the moment?
Oh man, we're just waiting for these guys to get traded. It's just someone trade Cam Johnson and Dorian Finney-Smith so we can talk about the new guys that are coming onto the team and how they got unloaded, and we don't have to make guesses about their minutes. This is what we're rooting for now. We got a ton of Nets content over the summer, but now the thing we're rooting for is get these veterans off the team so we can start thinking about more guys that we're not going to know how they're going to fit in.
Awesome. Go check out Locked On Nets. It is going to be a season with misery, but also positive misery, Doug, which is one of the things that people love. It's like, hey, we're bad, but let's look what we got moving forward, and let's highlight some of these younger guys coming in. Thanks again for coming on, Doug. It's been a pleasure to talk to you about the Brooklyn Nets.
Awesome, man. Thanks so much.
And that does it for talking about the Brooklyn Nets. There are certain times, like we do these preview shows, like there are guys I don't cover every single player with the local hosts of these teams. Like we didn't really talk anything about Dorian Finney-Smith or Nick Claxton here or Derek Whitehead. We will go into these guys when we do the fantasy preview on these shows. It's more about just getting the interesting stories, the broad overviews, some of the insights into how a team might work, and then we turn that into usable action later on. So I didn't think there was a huge value in talking about Nick Claxton at this point on this show, or even a Derek Whitehead or someone like that. So that's why we do it that way. There are certain players who will get a lot more focus time, because I think the bigger stories are what happens with Ben Simmons and Cam Thomas and how they use Noah Clowney. So we did focus more on those sort of players. Again, just giving you more of an insight in how I try to structure these shows. What you can structure is a thumb, and you can give it to me on the YouTube video. You can double bang this and listen to audio and watch the video, and you can leave comments down below. Guys, we are done here. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. See ya.